Hello again. You're joining me, Anne Diamond, on Viking.TV. And as I've promised, every week I've got somebody fascinating for you to meet. So shall we jump right in and meet this wonderful person who's got such a fascinating story to tell? Sit back and enjoy being part of the larger Viking family. While we can't go on holiday, we can certainly keep ourselves amused by meeting some of the most extraordinary people I can bring to you. The story of my next guest is a truly historic one. It starts hundreds of years ago, but I reckon one of the best ways to illustrate its importance and the drama of its history is through a wonderful piece of music written and performed against a backdrop of ancient palaces and castles, works of art, music, and a legacy of patronage that made it all possible. To catch that magic, please let me transport you back now to a very special day in June 1804, when a difficult young man, he was a brilliant composer, but a difficult young man, played his latest composition to his patron in Vienna. Just sit back and experience this wonderful piece of music and drama that captured what has turned out to be a groundbreaking moment.
I thought you lot were supposed to be good.
It's off the beat, sir. And there's so many markings, we can hardly read them.
Gentlemen, it is our first attempt. Patience, please.
Delicious, wasn't it? That was Beethoven's third symphony, known as the Eroica, and acclaimed as a work of genius. It is often hailed as the greatest symphony of all time. But just imagine, what if Beethoven had written it for your ancestor and performed its debut at your family home? What if Beethoven went on to dedicate his later great works, the fifth, da-da-da-dum, and the sixth, the pastoral, to your great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather? Well, you certainly would feel a connection, wouldn't you? And a dedication to honour that history and to preserve it, not only for your family, but for the world. And that's how it is for my guest. His family have for hundreds of years been enormously influential, once upon a time royal, always patrons of the arts and curators and creators of an astonishing heritage. So please meet William Lobkowicz, heir to a noble Czech family that dates back to the 14th century and is therefore one of the oldest Bohemian noble families. A very, very warm welcome to William. Hello.
Hello, Anne. It's nice to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's lovely to talk to you. And my goodness, we have so much to talk about. Where are you now? Where are you speaking from? And how is lockdown for you? How does lockdown even work in a palace?
Well, I'm in the Prague Castle in the Lobkowicz Palace, which is part of the Prague Castle, which is the largest castle complex in the world. It's over 1,000 years old. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it's now the seat of the president. So, and we are up here. There are usually over 5 million tourists coming through every year. We are absolutely alone, except for some soldiers walking around. And it's a very strange feeling, but we are going through, like you and like everybody around the world, this terrible time, but we are slowly coming out of lockdown. So they are very, very slowly this week, next week, starting to ease some of the restrictions.
I mean, I know for some people watching, they probably, they're lucky if they have gardens to be able to get out. You do have an enormous environment there, but do you actually get out? And if you go out onto the streets of Prague, do you have to wear masks? How is it at the moment?
Yes, in Prague, you're required to wear masks in public. And we do have some wonderful parks in Prague, so you can go there. People are bicycling a bit. We're easing up here because we've had lockdown since I think the first week in March. So we've been under lockdown for quite a while, and we've been fortunate. We've weathered the storm compared to some other countries relatively well. There are under 300 deaths here only, so we have to consider ourselves very fortunate.
Yes, I mean, 300 is clearly 300 too many, but compared to many other countries, that really is very low, isn't it?
Yes.
Which is good news. But I mean, Prague is known for its beauty. I know that it's used as a location for so many films, movies, and television programs and things like that. And of course, has such a huge tourist industry. It must feel very quiet at the moment.
It is, but there are, we are all, I think, everywhere trying to find the silver lining. So one of the advantages, of course, is that our monuments are very crowded, but walking across the Charles Bridge, which was built in 1359, and not having quite so many people on it and coming in the early morning or late at night is just spectacular, built by Charles IV. So we're kind of rediscovering Prague, which isn't so easy in your own city, as we all know, when tourism is running, and that's our main business. But it is strange, and we're greatly looking forward to ending lockdown and bringing back our Viking guests and other visitors to the city.
Absolutely. Well, Viking guests, of course, can't get to see you right now, but let's have a flavour of what hopefully we will all see again once things return to normal. Let's have a look at the Viking video of your environment.
Prague is spectacular, and there's much to see and do in this historic city. A favourite place, and in my opinion, one of the world's best curated museum experiences, is the Lobkowicz Palace in the Prague Castle grounds. The noble Lobkowicz family lost all their properties twice and regained them twice. First to the Nazis during World War II, and second to the Communists in 1948. Their story is fascinating, and our experience in the Lobkowicz Palace takes you on an intriguing journey of this important family. Powerful moments that actually, at one stage, made me cry. The first Prince Lobkowicz called the palace home in 1568, and through the passing centuries it grew into a centre of influence and power, with the family a rare source of continuity in Bohemia. But in 1939 the world changed. Maximilian Lobkowicz was forced to flee the family home of nearly 400 years on just a moment's notice.
My grandmother was on a train. She overheard some German soldiers talking about the big event that was going to be happening, the takeover in Czechoslovakia, wired my grandfather, and he was able to get out with my dad the night before the Nazis invaded the country.
Maximilian returned to his beloved palace in 1945. But when communism swept the country just 3 years later, he had to escape again, leaving with just his hat and his coat, never to return. As a result of the restitution laws, in the 1990s, Lobkowicz Palace and 9 other estates belonging to the family were finally returned after over 40 years. With significant restoration, the palace is immaculate once more, and the family have chosen to share with us one of Europe's greatest private collections of art, treasures that span nearly 5 centuries.
A lot of these things have been hidden for so long. We came across many of these things lying in depositories in damp conditions or not having been up on walls for a long time. So it's wonderful seeing them come back to life. It's such a pleasure to see things restored.
With inside access to the Lobkowicz family, Viking offers a privileged experience here. Every room, every display speaks to the family's fascinating royal past.
This is the Lobkowicz coat of arms.
So your coat of arms always has to be presented with the crown?
That was extremely
important.
important.
And the crown means
that meant we could marry the kings and queens, and that we were all born princes of the Holy Roman Empire.
Though titles were abolished long ago, the crest remains an important part of the family heritage. and it's still worn today on a signet ring on the left or the right little finger. Strolling amid one of the largest private art collections in Europe is a real treat, providing an insider's view of life in Bohemia, along with a diverse collection of rarely shown masterpieces, including 2 significant Canalettos and Bruegel the Elder's haymaking, one of the pinnacles of European landscape painting.
This little guy here, can you see him there? It's a whole painting, actually, in and of itself.
Yes,
if you put a little frame around it, it looks like, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
Isn't that wonderful?
But one of the most unexpected exhibits included this. Yes, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. This remarkable music is dedicated to the Lobkowicz family, Beethoven's faithful benefactor. Had it not been for the Lobkowicz family, some of the best-known pieces of classical music would not exist today.
If you look here, you'll see he's writing and scribbling and making everything there.
There are also handwritten manuscripts from Mozart and Haydn, along with instruments played by some of the world's greatest musicians. Enjoy these priceless artifacts, followed by a private concert in the Baroque Concert Hall.
The history of music in our family is really about their patronage of music. It reached its apex with the 7th Prince Lobkowicz. That particular Lobkowicz spent, I would say, a good part of the family fortune on music, but he enjoyed it, and I think we're all better for that.
Lobkowicz Palace is one of the most significant cultural sites in the Czech Republic, with many items that can be seen nowhere else in the world. After enjoying the compelling story of this royal family, pause to savor an elegant lunch in the Lobkowicz family's original living quarters. Let Prince William guide you through the authentic, continuing story of his Bohemian family navigating their way through the centuries.
I look forward to welcoming you to glorious Prague and to our family's palaces and princely residences. I'm William Lobkowicz, hosting Viking guests in the heart of Bohemia.
Viking river cruises. No one can show you the real, regal Czech Republic like we can.
Oh, I thought you'd love that, because that is just blissful. And that, of course, was William, my guest, showing Karina Hagen from the Viking family around those magnificent places and looking at those magnificent treasures. William, give us an idea, if you can, of where you are in the family tree, because I know that you were born in Boston and educated in the States. So how come you ended up in the States? Can you take us through that part of the family history?
Yes, well, there are about 20 generations going back, as you said, about 700, 800 years of our family back to the early 14th century. And my grandfather left here in 1939 with my father, who was a 12-year-old boy, and went to the United States fleeing the Nazis. Grandfather came back in 45, and then in 48 the communists came. So we ended up in America, in Boston, and my father met my mother on a blind date, and they were married. And I'm born in 1961 in Boston. So as you hear, I'm very much an American accent, and spent half my life there and now half my life back in Prague.
Well, absolutely. From being a very little boy, who told you about your heritage? I mean, you must have always felt part of a family in exile. Did you always feel you did want to return home?
I didn't really think of it so much about as returning home as there were always Czechs and Central Europeans coming through our house. So I was always hearing funny languages, Czech accents, German language, and all of this. So our house was really a mix. My father was always helping Czech refugees who were coming and getting them jobs or buying them a bus ticket to go, to Chicago, where there were a lot of Czechs, or Texas or other places. And so there was a lot of that in the house. And ever since I was a small boy, I was greatly interested in history and the stories of our family and where we came from and what this life was like. And I was lucky enough to have a number of aunts and relatives and people who came into the house and told us these stories. And I couldn't get enough of them. So that's what made me want to study history and languages and art later.
Absolutely. Well, why would you not want to, especially with that sort of background? So one of the most remarkable things about your story is that, I mean, we've just seen from the video there, the amazing heritage you have. But when you were growing up in the States, that heritage wasn't there for you to enjoy. You've had to rebuild it. Your family lost their heritage or had it stripped from them, not just once, but twice. Can you tell our audience what actually happened? As you mentioned there, first of all, it was to the Nazis. How did that happen? What happened literally there? I think your family had to flee almost overnight, didn't they?
Yes, well, the Nazis eventually came to Czechoslovakia in well, there's longer history to it, but anyway, the so-called Sudetenland, northwest part of the country, had a large German minority. Hitler was making problems there through a man named Henlein and so forth, and it made it very difficult. And then the sad, November 1938, where it was annexed, that part of the country. And my grandfather was very anti-Nazi and a very proud nationalist, and in the government and so on in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And so he was on Hitler's blacklist to be killed. And my grandmother, who was English, by the way, was on a train going to London. And she heard two German soldiers who got on and cursed at her in German to see if she spoke German. And she pretended she didn't understand. And then they talked about the big operations that were going to be happening in Czechoslovakia in the next couple of days. And she wired my grandfather, Max, and said, you and the boys have to get out. And they got out the night before the Nazis invaded the country. So we were very lucky indeed and came to London.
He would have been murdered.
He would have definitely been murdered. And then just, a few months later, or some months later, it started the Battle of Britain started. And so people were sending their children across to get out of harm's way, and it was looking like the Nazis were going to invade. So my father and his two younger brothers and a Scottish nanny got on a boat and went across the Atlantic, and the wolf packs were out there and the submarines and so on, but they got through and they landed in Boston, where a wonderful woman named Sylvia Warren, who had saved many families from Central and Eastern Europe, children from Central and Eastern Europe, had set up this committee. And she was trying to find a family for them, couldn't find one, said, well, you can stay in my house for a little while. And my father and his two younger brothers ended up staying with her for 6 years.
My goodness.
They were separated from their parents. So it was quite an adventure, but that's how our this U.S. charity began and saved our family.
And meanwhile, what was happening at home? I think your home was actually taken over as a camp for Hitler Youth.
Yes. So my father grew up, we had at that time 13 castles that my grandfather owned, and they lived in the main ducal residence called Rodnice Castle. And it's a 250-room castle. It's the fourth biggest in the country. And there were, to give you an idea, 46 servants in the house. And it was quite remarkable. There was a huge library and archives and collections, amazing things from hundreds and hundreds of years. And when they left, the Nazis came there with an SS Hitler Youth training camp. And so it was used for that purpose. And inside, they took out, for example, there was a great library there that had been for at least 400 years in these same rooms. And they stripped everything out and they made them into latrines, into bathrooms for these Hitler Youth. And they marched around the gardens and so on. And even in the archives, we found some pictures now that someone surreptitiously took. And so we're putting together more and more of this history that was missing, but it's absolutely fascinating.
The war did come to an end, thank goodness. I think your grandfather actually worked with Winston Churchill at one point. There's a rather lovely photograph of him with Winston Churchill. And then after that, he returned home after the war. And for a short while, he tried to reclaim your heritage, all of the things?
Yes, well, it was interesting. There were obviously Europe was a shambles in 1945. He came back and began the process of rebuilding, and property had been taken and sent. Hitler had come and stolen 2 or 3 of our, well, actually 6 paintings, Bruegel's, Rubens, Veronese, Velázquez, Cranach's, I mean, some of the great paintings in our collection, and he was going to have them in his museum in Linz, which of course never got built. And the Monuments Men, you may remember there was a movie and a book about this. The Monuments Men were basically curators who were attached to British and U.S. Army units in 1943 till 5, and their job was to go around liberating Europe and liberating over 5 million stolen objects. So it's an incredible story. And one of those caves that they found, actually, it was at the end of the movie. If you remember the movie,
yes, I do.
That's where our paintings were, and the Monuments Men got them back, saved them, brought them to Munich, which was the central depot of where all of these things were then redistributed to the owners. So it was remarkable that we got them back, and we have the U.S. Army to thank for that. And I think also partly in the British Army had some of these
yes, I think there were some Brits involved as well.
Absolutely.
But, so just as your grandfather might have thought, it is possible to rebuild. Then, of course, communism came to Czechoslovakia.
So it was only 2.5 years later. Everybody was trying, Prague was liberated by the Soviets. The Americans came as far as Pilsen in the west of the country, and then the Soviets were allowed to liberate Prague. And they made lots of machinations and issues. And in 1948, the country was taken over by the communists. And 1 month later, the foreign minister, Jan Masaryk, who was the son of the first president, Thomas Masaryk, was pushed out a window and killed. And my grandfather was trapped here. And so there was an amazing story, sort of out of Casablanca movie type ending, where my grandmother was in London, and she created an elaborate ruse with the help of the American and British ambassadors in London to invite the new communist ministers to see her in the hospital because she said she was dying. And they came to see that she was good and sick, and they said, okay, she's very sick. And my grandfather was able to get a 2-day pass. The borders were closed, but he was able to get a pass to basically come and bury his wife and come back. So he left with his hat and his coat. He was very fortunate to get out, and that's why all of our family was able to get out. But if it weren't for her quick thinking, my grandfather definitely would have been hung.
That is incredible. And the sheer fact that it happened twice to your family, to lose everything and to be in such danger of losing lives as well. And it happened twice. Once
10 years.
Once would be enough for anyone, exactly. You described how Hitler clearly tried to look after some of those paintings because he wanted them for himself. Yeah. What about some of the other things that we saw in the video? What about the Beethoven, the manuscripts, the instruments, all of those things? Where did they go?
Well, certain things were stolen. A lot of arms and armor was of interest to the Germans, so that left the country and came back. Some of these great paintings. But as Czechoslovakia was occupied, and fortunately there wasn't any real fighting here during the war, things were more or less left where they were. They were taken into some of the main museums, and some of the Germans who said they wanted them in their villas or palaces that they were occupying with their headquarters or whatever. But basically, everything stayed within the country, which was fortunate.
And looked after quite well.
But we were essentially out of the war from 1939, and there were the last days of the liberation. Before the liberation, of course, the uprising and fighting the Germans, as the liberating armies were coming through, was happening. But most of the things were here, except these great paintings, as I say, that were fortunately saved.
And you, meanwhile, in America, as you were growing older and studying more about these sort of things, did you feel a growing resentment about how Czechoslovakia was possibly sold out twice? How did it feel? Did you feel more and more as though you were somebody in exile?
I think it was different. I should say there were 3 generations of us. So from my grandfather's perspective, who died in 1967, he died essentially a broken man. He left at 60, having lost everything twice, as you said, and he lived in a strange country. He spoke 7 languages, came from another world. He was like a, fish out of water. But the host, Sylvia Warren, and took them in as well when the grandparents came, there was no place for them to go. So she essentially gave a section of her house over to our family of refugees, which was an incredibly wonderful thing to do. They had no money. She paid for the education of my father, and sent them to college, and the few things that were out of the country, they were able to sell an oriental carpet here, a musical instrument there, but essentially they were relying on the charity and generosity of this woman. So I think my grandfather, it was very sad. My father became American. He embraced America. He went to high school there and college, and went to Harvard and fought in the war, Korean War, and so on, and started his life as many people did. He was a Fuller paintbrush door-to-door salesman, and also sold Cutco knives, which were, every family had a set of Cutco knives. So he really started in that way, and then later became a stockbroker, and that was his career for his life. Yeah. So, but America gave us an opportunity to start again. It didn't matter where you came from. If you were willing to work hard and you wanted to, go and make something of yourself, you did it, and you acted. And he did, and then he built a family, wanted to have a house and a wife. I mean, all the things that were then the so-called American dream. And then we came along, the children, 4 children, and my world was of the romantic. So the third generation, by the time it got to me, it was the romantic world of some of the things you described, of Beethoven, what that must have been like growing up in a castle. We asked him questions about it, and trying to imagine this life. But of course, we were all feeling very happy that we didn't have to live under communism. We were very fortunate. And I would say this is what I was brought up on, was the sort of 3 principles of refugees. I don't know if this applies with other things, but we were always taught that the 3 most important things in life are your family, your faith, and your education. And the reason is because those are 3 things that can never be taken away from you.
Yeah.
And in our case, going from being maybe the wealthiest family and one of the oldest families in Czechoslovakia to taking charity from a deaf lady in Boston, Dover, Massachusetts, was really quite a change. But those are those underlining principles that we grew up with. And my wife's family also were refugees from Romania, from an old Romanian family. And it was the same thing. You got the best education you could. You worked hard, you have your faith, and your family, you stay tight with your family, and you work hard, and you build what you can build.
But when the Berlin Wall came down, was there an extra tug on those heartstrings that maybe you could go back?
Oh, I'll never forget it. We were sitting in our living room watching these events happen. It was actually the Berlin Wall, and then it was actually for us more these East Germans, refugees who were taking refuge in the West German embassy in Prague, that created this whole chain reaction of events that a couple of months later, I mean, literally that quickly, we had in Czechoslovakia our poet, playwright, president, Václav Havel. And this was incredible for us. We just couldn't believe it. And I wanted to get back here as soon as possible. Our whole family did. And we didn't have really any, I mean, people say, oh, you went to Harvard, you must have had a plan and all these things. Forget it. We knew nothing. It was full on call of your roots. We wanted to be back in this country. We wanted to be part of the changes. We wanted to be here, and as the country came out of a 40-year hangover, and put things back, the way they were. And there weren't even restitution laws, actually, when we first came here, but it was so exciting to be here. I was at the very first free Mass in St. Vitus Cathedral, right here next to the palace, and people flowing out into the main square, and Cardinal Tomaszek there, and we were packed in like sardines, and we were listening to this Mass and being here and just taking it all in, and we just were hugging each other. It was the most remarkable
it was
time.
really,
I'll never forget it.
I'll never forget it. I was in Berlin when the wall came down.
You were there. Oh, that must have been.
I didn't see forget Berlin. That sheer human surge of warmth towards each other, and the idea of freedom being available once again. So there you are, as you said, the heartstrings were utterly tugged. You went back there, but had no idea where did you even start to try and rebuild what once there was?
Yeah. Well, you start with a lawyer. Well, I should start at the beginning. The beginning is really our family. I mean, what we did was we sat and had a meeting, and the two things that we said was, we have to go back. It was the old, what do you tell your grandchildren if you didn't even try? This was really the question we said. So we said we'd go back, and I said, Dad, I've got no money. Do you? And he said, I've got a little, but my father was 63 and my mother was 61 at the time. And they were, near sort of traditional retirement at 65. I think that's out the window today.
It is.
But I came over, I moved over here, and I couldn't think of anything more exciting to do. And then there were these, rumblings about restitution laws and so on. And I said to my dad, I said, do you have some money? Can I hire a lawyer? And he said, yeah. I've got a bit of money. You can hire a lawyer, see what you can do. And my father only said to me, try not to lose it all, which I thought always very funny. But I always, without him and his willingness to believe in me, a 28-year-old coming over here and having no idea, and restitution is unprecedented, of course. There's nothing like this. These sort of things happen every 300 or 400 years when there's a, major
revolution
problems, but none of us knew what we were doing. And my mother, then very shortly after that, was very inspirational. And she said, what are we going to do with these places? And we had a big talk, and we said, if we were lucky enough to get them back in restitution, we obviously grew up in normal American households. We weren't planning to live in castles or have tiaras on our heads or anything like that. And all of the history, while wonderful, isn't 21st century. It isn't realistic today. So what were we going to do with these places, most of them that were broken down, and trying to gather all these collections together? So we said, well, we'll open the castles. We'll do what you do so well in England, which is bring these places back to life and make the collections available to the world for the first time. And that's what we are doing and continue to do. And
what a mammoth task it is. We've got a lovely shot of you outside. Well, you'll have to tell me where it's outside because I've never been. There we are. Now, where are you there?
I have to see the picture now. Wait a minute. They're showing. Where am I? Oh, I'm in front of, yes, that's Rodnice Castle. That is where my father grew up. So that's that huge castle that the SS Hitler Youth were occupying. And I didn't answer your question, Anne, earlier about how did we go about finding things, which I think is important to tell you. So we had nothing. We had no papers, very little money. And I was at a reception at the Ministry of Culture, and a lady I knew there said, you should meet this judge. He's a very interesting man. And I spoke with him, and he loved art, architecture, and he had been a guide in castles. And then I got onto the subject of postcards. And I said, I have a collection of historical postcards, and I have about 500 of them, and where I've traveled in Europe and England and Central Europe. And he said, that's interesting. I have one too, and I haven't counted them, but I think I have something like 10 or 20,000. And I thought at that moment, I have found my soulmate, and I did. And he became our main restitution lawyer. He was a divorce court judge at the time, but he was one of these very special people that was passionate. And he and I became, many names, Mutt and Jeff. We were like an old married couple. He and I just bonded from that first day. And our mission was to find all the papers, see what we could reconstruct, and then trace every object in our collection. And there was a lot. They were in, our collections were in over 100 locations around the country. We had tens of thousands of movable objects that were in 13 castles that had been spread all over the country, a 65,000 book library, 5 million archival documents, 5,000 musical scores. I mean, it was crazy. And so we went to all these different places. And so one castle, we finally would find out where the things were, and then we'd show up and we'd say, okay, we would like to have the contents of the Lobkowicz collections. Here are the papers. We've been in the archives for a couple of years and finding everything. And there might be 500 pieces of paintings here. There might be 1,000 pieces of decorative arts over there. There might be 150 guns and crossbows and antler heads over there. And we would go to these different places. And in the early days, we didn't have anywhere to put them. And so we had to be very creative. So I got help from the Knights of Malta. They had an empty building. I bricked up the windows. I stored things there. We didn't have vans or trucks or anything. So my lawyer's uncle had a van from work that we would borrow during the day to go and pick things up. And then we had to put them somewhere, so that we hid them in my lawyer's mother's garden shed, which we thought nobody would ever look there. So we had, some priceless things in there that were there for weeks and months until some of the properties came back and we actually had rooms to put things in. So it was really an adventure, and it took us 25 years from start to finish to get back all of the objects in our family. Sorry, that's too long a story, but
no, I cannot
process.
believe the mammoth task you took on, and the way your life, as soon as that Berlin Wall came down and things started to free up, your life turned on a sixpence, didn't it? It became totally different.
It did, and it felt right though, and it felt like, it's one of those moments, being in the right place. I studied European and history and music. I knew from my relatives many stories. My parents had given me opportunities to study abroad. I did my gap year in Vienna. I visited Czechoslovakia a couple of times before that. I knew some of my cousins. I wrote to my aunts and uncles. I loved history. So it's great fun for me. So it was really all of the things that I loved. And then being in the right place at the right time too.
Yes.
It's not the traditional eldest son. I'm the youngest of four. I was in an opportunity where I didn't have any debts at that moment. I didn't have a wife or responsibilities. I just had to go to my job, and I could pack up and go. And as it turned out, the timing was just right. And this country has been incredible. Well, the story of the Czech Republic has just done incredible things in the last 30 years.
Absolutely. What have you, in all of this, piecing together the jigsaw again of your family's legacy, have you learned anything that surprised you, shocked you about any members of your family?
Well, I think that I learned a lot more about the suffering of my uncle and my cousins over the last 40 years and what they had to live through. And that always, for me, was, incredible, great respect. I learned a lot about my ancestors. The seventh Prince Lobkowicz, for example, who you started with, who was bankrupted our family essentially.
Yes, he was a little too keen. Yeah, he was such a keen patron of the arts. He nearly spent every penny your family had.
Well, I can go even further than that, because now that we have scholars coming in to our collections and doing all the studying, I've learned a lot of new things. And he was a terrible businessman, but he was an incredible amateur musician. He was passionate and treated the musicians better than he did his own family. He sent carriages for them. He paid all their expenses. He served them beautiful meals. He treated them like gold. And as a result, he had some of the greatest music of the day.
Yeah.
And but one of the historians that's actually coming out with a book about his life and the musical history in our family. It's going to be, I think, 700 or 800 pages. She's been working on it for 20 years. But one of the things she discovered was some papers from a lawyer who was part of the bankruptcy team that had to bail out Lobkowicz.
Oh.
And he was a part of this. And in his letters, he writes that the emperor came to one of these meetings when they were working through things. And the emperor really saved Lobkowicz, because I think he thought, if we lose a family like Lobkowicz that is so loyal to the Habsburg Empire, and that wouldn't be a good thing. So I think the emperor was persuading people to go easy on us and forgive a few debts and things. But it took about a generation to get the money back. That's how much he spent. But we like to say in the family, it was money very well spent.
Well, not off, as we say in Britain, not off. I mean, would Beethoven have done so well without him? Would he have written what he did without the patronage of
yes. And this was the great, I would say, contribution of it's actually four greats, the great-great-great-great-grandfather. His great contribution really was allowing Beethoven to create the kind of music that he wanted to write rather than necessarily what his patrons wanted to hear. Or the example of Haydn, who was actually an employee of Esterházy and worked for the man, but had to play whatever he wanted to hear. And Lobkowicz and a few other patrons too gave Beethoven this chance to really create, and as you said, some of the greatest music of all time. And this year, Anne, you probably know, is the 250th anniversary birthday of Beethoven. And we have been lending, and we're going to be lending more things in our collections to the Kunsthalle in Bonn. We've already done an exhibit. We're going to be doing a wonderful thing with the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna in the fall. It's been put off, but there's some wonderful Beethoven anniversaries concerts, and now we've got a series we were doing, and now we're organizing live streaming. So that'll be coming in the next weeks and months. So there's a lot happening this year around Beethoven.
Oh, absolutely. Well,
it's an exciting year.
It's a perfect anniversary to do it. And of course, Beethoven isn't the only one. I know that. What happened to the Dvorak House? Did you eventually manage to get that on board?
Yes. Well, the Dvorak House so Antonín Dvorak, the great 19th century Czech composer, his birth house is right next to Nelohozovec Castle, which is the other main museum we have now open to the public about 15 miles north of Prague. And there we are creating a study center, an education center, where we will bring all of our books and archives, millions of archival documents and tens of thousands of books back in a built-to-suit, purpose-built building that will allow us to open all of these hidden treasures and things that have never been studied before, really virgin material for the first time, is going to be based at Nelohozovec. So you can visit the castle, but also it's going to be a major center of learning. But part of that center of learning or cultural heritage center is this house, which is about 50 yards across from the castle on the main square. And we've just taken it back about 6 months ago, but the house has been in a very sad place for the last half century anyway, and it deserves to be, one of the great places. I mean, in America, I know most of your audience or the bulk of your audience are coming from America, and Dvorak has so many connections with all of us. He has a degree from Cambridge in England. He has 3 years in America. He wrote the New World.
He wrote the New World.
One of the most wonderful places where he listened to our American music and said, there's music here, and put it in the Largo and the Second Music and Going Home, and father of American jazz, and using black spirituals and all of these wonderful things he did. So we love the Dvorak connection because it's part of our heritage, our American heritage as well, but it's world heritage. So this house is really going to be a tribute to him. We are making it 2.5 times bigger than it currently is, and it's being completely, we actually have the whole master plan done. We have terrific English architects called Wright and Wright. They're amazing. They're doing Lambeth Palace right now in London, and they specialize with archives and libraries and historic houses, Jeffreys Museum, Cambridge, Oxford, and so on. And so they have come up with a plan. We've gotten permissions, and we've applied for an EU grant. So we are, as they say, we are running, and we're going to make this a place that young musicians can come. We're creating a music academy. We're going to show the early life of Dvorak, who was a butcher's son, and we're going to explore how is it possible. He lived there until he was almost 12, but how was the development of this great man? How does he come from this poor butcher's family and become one of the most famous and beloved composers still to this day? And so we're really going to explore that there and bring this house to life again as it should be. So that's a very exciting project. It'll take us some time. We need to raise money. COVID obviously has set us back, but we're going to raise the money, and it's going to be a wonderful place.
But actually what you're doing is you're continuing your family tradition, aren't you? You
Indeed.
You are patronizing the arts, as it were.
Well, and we do a music festival. We've done, just to give you an idea, just in the last 30 years, we've had 3.5 million people already through our castles, and we've done 4,500 concerts in that time as well. So we aren't sitting idly by, but if we can raise a bit of money, not a whole lot, but I think we can do a lot more and make this really a kind of phoenix rising out of Bohemia with all of this great history and cultural heritage and music. So it's really drives us and excites us every day we jump out of bed.
I was going to ask you, if one day you meet your ancestors on a cloud somewhere, how will you justify your part in the family
That's
drama?
a great question.
But I think you've just said, haven't you, really?
Well, I hope they'll be. It's funny you mention that, because I always wonder if they think, are you crazy? What are you doing with these things? But also, I'm a student of history, and as I've kind of looked back, every generation of Lobkowicz did different things. Some were military generals and, running the Imperial War Council during the 30 Years' War. The seventh prince was one of the greatest patrons of all time of Beethoven. Others were collecting books and doing things. So the way I view it, and I hope when I get there, my ancestors will pat me on the back and say, okay, you didn't do too badly. But I think here we are in the 20th century. I mean, we've lost, as you said, everything twice and gotten it back twice. It's a miracle that we were allowed to return to the country. And here we are in the 21st century. And what do you do with these things? We don't live in castles anymore. We don't want to live in castles anymore. The collections are part of world cultural heritage. And that's why our mission is to preserve, study, and share the Lobkowicz collections with the world. It's that simple. And so I think that also is the way that we're stewards, we're custodians. And I think that if we can preserve and protect these things, but also share them, then I think it will give them a life that will last hopefully another 700 years. And we won't need huge wealth because we don't have it anymore. And these financial underpinnings that the ancestors had. Today, we have to be clever and find ways to preserve them. But if we keep that continuity together, I think it's very exciting. And in the 21st century, we have technology. So we can digitize, we can save things, we can make them available to someone halfway across the world who can study about Beethoven that would never have the chance to get on a plane or to come over perhaps. And it opens everything up in the possibilities, digital humanities, new ways of studying today. So there are a lot of very exciting things. Look at our technology that you and I can sit here and have a conversation. So it's really wonderful. Virtual tours, all of these things we're working very hard on. So
it's brilliant. And I think if you ever have to justify anything to your ancestors, just show them this picture, which I think is one of my favorites of you. You're just sitting there utterly exhausted in a chair.
Am I in the chair? Yes.
If that doesn't say it all, I don't know what does. That
was the early days of restitution. I think that was 91 or 92, and we were running pretty hard. And this is unfortunately a lot of the houses that we came that belonged to my grandfather were in these kinds of shape, unfortunately. But we've cleaned them up.
What of the next generation? Do they feel the legacy as a responsibility? Is it a burden or a mission to them?
Yeah, great question. I think it's a little bit of both. Remember now, so my grandfather is born and raised in Czechoslovakia. My father is born and raised there until he's 12. Then I come along, I'm born in America, not expecting to come back. So I'm 28. Now I've spent 30 years here, so half of my life here. And all of our children, our 3 children, are born and raised in Prague. So we are truly the global family. And they have a bit of everything. And the way we have approached it with our kids is, we've never lived in the palaces. I know people always ask us, and they always seem slightly disappointed. And I'm sorry to say that, but we work in the palaces and we spend more time than we sleep in the palaces, but we don't live here. But I think what we've tried to do is be very practical and make sure that our kids have their feet on the ground. Yeah. That they have been born into a family that is, it has a wonderful tradition, but they have to get a great education. Again, back to the 3 things: family, faith, and education. This is how we've tried to raise them, and getting a good education. And now my son is 25 and is responsible for all of this, why I'm here, because I have no idea how to do this. My
one of those
to school in Boston, and came back. So he's done America, and again, like his pop, went to Harvard. So I was very proud of him. And we have a bit of a tradition in Boston. And my daughter went to Boston College. She's 22, studied philosophy, and ran the school newspaper. And now they're back working in the family firm. But they have nowhere to go now, so they're sort of stuck. So we're using them, of course, as much as we can. But we always said to them, look, we'd love for you to be involved. Of course we would, but get some experiences, make up your mind, see the world a bit, and see if it's something you want to get involved in some way. And I think today we have to be very practical, because I think if you try to push your kids into saying, well, you've got to take this on and we're tired, you have to do this, and you put a trip on them, I think it's not a good thing. I think this is the kind of job and the kind of mission that we have here, where you really need the passion and the drive to do it successfully. So we have over 100 employees now, which is, I can't even believe I'm saying that number. And every one of they're mostly professionals, and the kids can do this they can be shareholders in something. They can be sitting on some meetings. They can be working in one of the departments, or they can take on operations or management positions as well. But they need to be qualified, and they need to be judged in the same way we would judge anybody whose responsibility it will be to take care of the collections and to advance the projects and the things that we're doing. And ultimately, all of them, professional or family members, they have to make it last for another 700 years. That's what we always joke.
Wow.
You've got to make it keep going.
Yeah, no pressure. No pressure. I've got some lovely questions to ask you.
Great.
People who are watching right now, from Lena in Oslo. She says, what a fantastic family story and what an interesting life. I have two questions. One, what is the most interesting object you have discovered in any of your castles? And has anyone ever played those instruments?
Great question. Well, thank you for the question. What's the most interesting thing we have? We have so many things that are interesting. I mean, if you like religious objects, there's a wonderful bust that we have from 1320, and it's a bust of Saint Ursula, and it was used for reliquary. It was a reliquary head bust. Yeah. And it was is a very important piece in our collections, but it was lost in the past centuries. And in the 1930s, it was rediscovered in a box of theatrical props in our summer castle, where there was a performance going on. So it was rediscovered, and it's now one of the main pieces in our collection here on display at the Lobkowicz Palace. We've lent it to the Metropolitan Museum in New York, and so on. It's one of those things that is just fun to me, the life it's had. It was very important and revered, and then it was sort of lost, and then it was used in a play. The idea of these living history of these objects, sort of like some of these movies, the violin, the piano. Yes. I always love that story with the bust, but there's so many wonderful things. We are going to come out very soon with a we're shooting them now, some 60-second spots on interesting things in our collection. So I won't spoil it.
That'll keep you going a while.
But I think she might be interested to see about that. Sorry, what was the second question?
Anyone ever played those instruments?
Yes, the instruments, we've had experts come in. It's a great question, because I've been thinking the same thing. We had an expert come in and look at the lutes. We don't... Basically, the word we get is when you repair something from the experts, it doesn't necessarily mean they'll look nice, they'll be preserved, but it doesn't necessarily mean you will ever get the sound or any proper sound out of them. So we haven't gone there just yet, but it's on my mind, and maybe one or two of the violins might happen down the road. So stay tuned. Maybe we will.
There's a lot of people getting in touch saying, have you got a book about your family history?
We have a publication done by Scala Publishers, and you can find it either on our website, lobkowicz.cz, in the store, and it probably should be on Amazon as well. And it simply is called the Lobkowicz Collections, and that gives an overview of the collections, and it's very nice, and there's some beautiful pictures of it. A new publication that we just came out with several months ago is the Lobkowicz Collections Music Series. And this was the 6-year culmination of a 6-year music cataloging project of all of the 4,500 scores or 5,000 scores that I mentioned and objects. And that book is also available, I think, on Amazon and from Scala and through us. And then we hope at the end of this year, there will be a publication just on Beethoven. It's being reviewed now by the publishers. So we want to have it in time for his birthday in December. And then this huge publication, again, around music, the 700 or 800 publication, we hope by end of next year. So we're actually very busy.
I don't know where you get your energy from. I'm going
lots
to have
of
to
good scholars doing it.
Well, yes, thank goodness. Well, and they must feel privileged to do so as well, to actually have access to
Well,
those
we're so
schools.
grateful for them
Oh,
to
yes.
come and study too, because this is our mission. This is what we want. So we're
It's a
delighted
symbiotic
that they're
relationship, really, isn't it?
here. It is.
They can
It
tell
is.
you about the things that are in front of you as well. But
And then we have more stories, Anne, and it's an important point to make, because what we're doing here is not just for scholars or just for the layman. It's for everybody. So when the scholars make discoveries, it goes to our foundation office. It's put on our audio guides. We do family-led audio guides through our museums. It is reading materials that people can use when they go through, if they prefer that. And it allows us to be able to disseminate this scholarly information, but also bring it to the public in, an abbreviated way, so that they can connect more with the collections, with the characters. I mean, we're going through thousands of letters of ancient princes and princesses and how they spoke to each other, how they lived, social history. And this is what all of our guests are asking about. Tell us more stories about family members. So we're doing a lot of that now.
it's the stories we want.
Fun.
In fact, are you indeed a prince?
We are princes and princesses. So we were raised to princes by Emperor Rudolf II, who was the only Habsburg emperor to have his court in Prague. And my ancestor, who became the first prince, we were counts and barons before that, so we were titled. But because of our service to the Habsburgs, he raised us to princes of the Holy Roman Empire. So it means every Lobkowicz who is born Lobkowicz is actually, man or woman, is a prince. In many other families, usually a prince is just the titular head of that family. So they might be counts, but the head could be called a prince or head of the family, or Fürst in German. So we were very high on the, let's say, scale here in Central Europe with those titles. But in 1918, when we became Czechoslovakia, titles were abolished. The Habsburgs were thrown out. And so there are no titles in this country anymore. However, in a number of countries around Europe, so if I go to a dinner or something, the titles are sometimes used, because in places like England or Germany or Belgium or Spain, where there are still monarchies, titles are still used. So that's but in this country, technically,
you don't use them.
We are not. We don't use the title, and it's part of our history, Anne. And we aren't, as I say, we're not living in the castles.
No.
We're not
but it is
doing the things, but it is an old.
It is a respect for the history, and I tell you what, all of those different regimes that sought to rob not just your family but actually the country of its heritage, sought to do that not once but twice, and actually more often as well.
Yes.
What you've been able to do is a real triumph over that, isn't it?
It is. There have been many triumphs, but we're never sitting down for long, because there's always something more to do. There are always dangers. We need to fundraise. We need to raise millions of dollars to house this library and these archives safely for the future. We need to create reading rooms, study rooms, restoration labs, studios, so that we can access this virgin material. It's like digging up King Tut's tomb. These things were never shared. They were just collected over 800 years. And this is the great thing. And it's our world heritage. It is our responsibility, and we really take it very seriously. We want these things to be studied. We want a young person to come and be inspired to become, Yo-Yo Ma, to become a great museum director, curator, conservator, or just simply understand that art and culture needs support. It's always the bottom of every government's, when there's a crisis. It's always the last thing, and it's not our history, it's world history. So I think it's important that we talk about it always in those terms, and we have to do what we can to make the facilities, to make the ability for people to come in and see them. So we don't see that work as sort of ever ending. So yes, we've had triumphs. We say our triumph is we're still alive. We're still going after 30 years, actually. But there are always new projects and new things to do, and we still have some major challenges ahead to really secure these things. I think that's the next big thing, to be sure they're really safe, secure, and then we can dig into them much more efficiently. And that's what we're anxious to do now.
William, we've been talking for a full hour. And I could talk to you all for at least another 2 or 3 hours without getting even bored. But and
you're
so
very
many
patient.
So many people are texting in with questions, many of which you've already answered, frankly, and they're going to get a chance to watch you again on Viking TV, because I know that you're going to be talking. I think you're going to be giving a virtual tour of one of your palaces, I think, next Wednesday on Viking TV, so people can watch out for that.
Thank you. Yeah, and we're preparing for that, and we're going to be all alone in the Lobkowicz Palace. This will probably never happen again in these historic times. So we'll be going through alone, which will be interesting, but I'll look forward to having the company, and I'm very excited to take you all through and tell you some stories and show you some beautiful things.
That's right. Well, I was thinking, are there any more treasures for you to find? Do you have a list of things you still want to locate?
I think not. I've heard a rumor that a painting that's supposedly burned up in a fire might be in Russia, but it isn't a very important painting, and I don't think I'll ever find out. That's the only thing. I think we're very fortunate, because the major things, remember, came back. We have the Monuments Men to thank for that. The great Peter Bruegel the Elder painting of haymaking, the greatest old master painting in private hands. The 2 great Canalettos, one of which the Queen had for her 60th Jubilee. You know, these are the real treasures.
That's right. The Canaletto, of course, is of the wonderful river festival. And yes, we had it here in Britain for 2012, was it? For the big River Jubilee Festival that we were going to have. Well, we still did have, but it got terribly rained on.
Well, there are actually 2 of them, 2 views of London, and the one that was borrowed for the Queen's thing was in 2012 was the one with all the boats in it. And there was actually a very funny story around this, because with our American accents, people don't really believe this world when you start to say, I get the question, you know, sitting on a flight, when we used to sit on flights, that what do you do? And trying to explain, well, you know, I run museums, or I'm a consultant, and try to keep it low key, but no one really believes it. And there was a just very quick funny story around this with my father. Around that time, my father got Lyme disease, you know, which is quite serious. He was pushing 80 at the time, but he was okay, and he was in a hospital in Boston, and he was checking out with the doctor, and the doctor was asking him his name and his birthday and all these things. Everything was fine, and and my father saw that his name was William, my name, and he said, "Oh, I have a son who lives in Prague," and the doctor said, "Oh, Prague, it's on my bucket list. I want to go there. What does he do in Prague?" And my father said, "Oh, he takes care of all of my castles and my art collections." And so the doctor was, oh boy, something's happened here. So he said, "Really, tell me more about that, Mr. Lobkowicz." And my father went on to tell him that, yeah, you're not going to believe this, but a week ago, we got a call from Queen Elizabeth's office. And she wants to borrow one of my Canalettos, because, you know, she's 60 years on the throne, and my wife and I just celebrated our 60th anniversary, and she seems like a nice lady, so I'm going to lend it to her. So the doctor, you know, backs out of the room, and he says, "Can you wait here 1 minute?" Runs down the hall and tells the chief doctor, "Lobkowicz in room 3. We're going to have to lock him up. He thinks he knows Queen Elizabeth and has castles and art collections." So they came down, and they practically were ready to tackle my father. And they said, "You're not leaving this hospital because the Lyme disease has, you know, done something to you." And he said, "No, there's been a terrible misunderstanding." So my sister luckily flew in and saved him by showing an article in one of these magazines we had been in with this Canaletto in question. So I always like to tell people we nearly lost my father that day, not for the reasons that he went into the hospital, but it's the story of Canaletto and all of these things is just, it's still today surreal, but
it is, and actually
very amusing sometimes too.
Well, wasn't that the very first time that painting had ever left Czechoslovakia?
Yes, you're right. The painting, my ancestor, the 6th Prince, when he was 24, went to London. He was supposed to marry the Duke of Richmond's daughter, who was an important man at the court. Didn't happen. He then had an affair with the Venetian ambassador's wife. Through the Venetian ambassador's wife, he met Canaletto, who had just arrived in London. He lived in London for 9 years. He was going around painting, you know, great country houses and seeking his fortune. introduced to Lobkowicz. Lobkowicz said, I like your paintings. Could you do a couple for me? Pack them up, ship them back to Bohemia, where they sat until the Queen's office called and said, we're doing the Jubilee, would you lend it? So it hadn't been back to England. It was bought in England from Canaletto, brought back to Bohemia, hadn't been back to England in 263 years or something like that. So it was an incredible thing. I mean, the timing of that, we were so pleased to be part of that wonderful celebration. And the 1,000-boat flotilla, you remember that amazing thing they put on, I guess that hadn't been done in 350 years.
That's right.
And our picture is the only representation, which is why they called us, of the Thames and London, and with all of these great barges and boats. And it's actually the Lord Mayor's procession to Westminster, going down to receive whatever you did, the chains of office from the Admiralty. But it's this beautiful sort of Venetian looking, but of course it isn't, celebration. And it's so beautiful too, because you see the skyline of London. And you see all these Christopher Wren churches, which of course many of them have burned in the various fires. But it's just it's a wonderful story around these English connections. And
do you find, I find it very interesting, you coming from such an ancient family there in Prague, and also you're an American, you come from both worlds in a way. When you speak to American people, and there's a tremendous amount of Americans watching right now,
yes.
Are they completely bamboozled by the sort of centuries that you can talk about? You talk about your family going back 600-700 years. Those numbers are absolutely mind-boggling to particularly American people, aren't they?
Yeah, I think, and we've always had a lot of and because we know a lot of Americans, we come from America, but I think the questions we get the most are about the titles. They wonder if we're living in the palaces, and as I said, usually people are a little disappointed that we're not running around in some of the rooms. But I think the thing that really surprises them is when I talk about these things, I have this American accent, and they're maybe expecting, the way an English lord, if I come into an English house, I want to see a pipe and an ascot and all these things, and I sort of talk fast and furious and wave my arms, and I get excited about the topics. But what I like to do, American or otherwise, is I want to tell the stories of this history. That's what's fun. Social history is what all of our clients who come here, they say, we love that it's a Bruegel, but why is it here? Who collected it? Who is Bruegel? Why should I care? And that's what we do in our organization. We always say, but why? Is this entertaining? And it doesn't mean dumbing it down. It means making it entertaining. Find stories, because life is about, stories. And we always talk about making history come alive, making culture relevant. We have to live with it. It's 21st century. It's back to this theme again. And I think you will also, if we engage people in a wonderfully interesting way where they are inspired, then they will buy a ticket. They will sponsor Dvorak's house. They will bring their children
because they'll feel
to see something and become a musician. So it all goes together. But I think this storytelling is so important because it's ingrained in all of our DNA. And so we're looking for the stories, and that's why we want scholars and students and more people to come.
Well, I can't thank you enough for sharing your stories with us.
Well, thank you for letting me. I'm so honored to be with you.
And when we can fly and cruise on beautiful Viking river cruises again, I hope one day to be able to meet you in person, and thank you.
Well, we are ready, and I want to say this to all the Viking listeners. We are so excited to have you. We've loved working with Viking. We look forward to it, and we will be ready with whatever we need to be ready with, from gloves to hand sanitizers to things over our mouth. It doesn't matter. We have to keep going. We have to keep having a good time. We have to keep engaging with our culture and our history and having wonderful experiences. And we can do it in a lot of different ways. So don't lose hope.
Well, as I said, anyone who wants more can tune into Viking TV next Wednesday, where you'll be doing this virtual tour and telling more stories, I hope. I look forward to seeing you again then. And I just thank you so much for sharing those stories. I've absolutely had the most marvelous time meeting you today, and I'm sure everybody else has too. Thank you so much, William.
Thank you so much, Anne.
And my love to your family, and stay safe.
Thank you. And all of you too. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
seeing
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Absolutely. Wow, wasn't that absolutely brilliant and inspirational? And as I said, if you want to know more from William, if you want to see more, next Wednesday on Viking Television, you'll be able to find out more. As for me, next Thursday, I have a very special guest that I know a lot of people watching right now who will be very interested in. She is the actress Leslie Nichol, who is Mrs. Patmore from Downton Abbey. And she will be joining me from Los Angeles, actually, where she lives for much of the time right now. She'll be telling me how Downton Abbey has been her passport to fame, fortune, but particularly fun. So do join me again next Thursday when I'll be meeting her. And keep watching Viking television and find it as inspirational, I hope, as we mean it to be. From me, Anne Diamond, here in Buckinghamshire, in good old England, thank you very much for joining me. And a great big thank you too to the Lobkowicz family for joining us from Prague. Thank you. Bye-bye.